Good evening, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm Hammi, and I'll be your host tonight and the nights that will follow. On Let's Just Talk with Hammi, we strive to bring nuance and complexity back to public discourse by engaging and putting different faculty members from across disciplines in conversation with one another to address the issues that truly matter. Today's issue or topic is the psychology of bias and policing social identities in relations to police brutality and vigilante attacks in the United States. To offer some perspective on these issues, we are joined by esteemed professors Dr. Megan Carpenter and Dr. Sandhya Ganapathy, one from the psychology department and the other from the global studies department. I'm excited to have you guys here, and thank you for being here. Uh, the way this is going to work is that each one of you is going to have 5 minutes to introduce your perspective on the issue, and then I have some questions, and we'll delve into the conversation in understanding the psychology of bias and policing social identities in relations to police brutality and policing social identities. So we're gonna start with Dr. Megan, Dr. Carpenter, or Megs. Take it away.
Absolutely. One thing that I would like to talk about in this forum is the role of implicit bias, both in police violence towards Black and Brown people, but also in terms of vigilante attacks, like Hami was mentioning. So, a lot of people are under this misconception that racism is this really explicit act and that racism no longer exists because it doesn't look the way that it did, say, in the 1950s. But that really begs the question, how do we have so many issues with racism today when no one is a racist, right? When no one looks the way that we would describe racist. And that's really where implicit bias comes in. It is completely possible and probable that people have hidden biases that they might not even be consciously aware of. And these are biases that influence our behavior, but we might not initially be able to identify them as being racist in nature. So that makes you think, okay, how do we develop these unconscious biases, especially surrounding race? And there's a lot of ways that that happens. In some ways, that's through direct contact with social groups, but in a lot of ways, it's through indirect contact, like exposure to the media. So when you think about how Black people, especially Black men, are portrayed in the media, when you think about coverage in the news, when you think about the disproportionate number of Black actors that are portraying criminals in TV shows and the movies, a lot of that information gets into our implicit biases. That's how we develop this idea of what the world is really like. So you can go your entire life without having met a Black person, or without having met a trans person, or without having met a gay person, or any other marginalized identity group, but still develop very distinct biases against those people. So our police individuals, or people in the police force, people who just have really heightened biases more so than the rest of the population? No. Police generally show the same amount of implicit bias as the general population. It's not the case that there's just a few bad apples in the police force, right? Implicit bias is rampant throughout the United States and throughout the world, but it makes it particularly dangerous when we think about police violence because police are in positions of power and are often in situations where they're likely to perceive a threat, and they have to make quick decisions that can result in deadly consequences, right? Which is not typically true for the general population. So implicit bias within the police force is a distinct problem, especially when we think about violence and killing of Black Americans. So a lot of the different tactics that have been used recently in police reform have been in terms of implicit bias training and de-escalation trainings, things like that. But one problem that we're facing, particularly in the field of psychology, is we have very little data about whether those trainings are effective, right? Because it's voluntary if they want to give data to scientists, to researchers. on those different trainings or if they even want to participate in them. So we're left with very little information about whether the things that we're doing are actually working.
Thank you for that summation. I would have a lot to say about that later on. Sandhya, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Hammi, and thank you, Meg, for that perspective. I was thinking about all kinds of linkages between the way you approach the subject matter and how it intersects or inflects my way of thinking about it. And so when Hammi, you first asked us to, or asked me to participate and reflect on police brutality and vigilante attacks. I mean, I was like, so this is my process as a global studies person. The first thing my mind went to was to think about the victims and the family members. And I spent some time just reflecting on that, this grief and trauma facing Black families, Indigenous families, and just other families that have been victimized by this profound loss, this rending apart families, this irreparable loss. And so I had to just think about that for a minute. And the other thing I thought about is just, in having this conversation, how, and thinking about the summer of 2020 and building upon that, and then us coming here and having this conversation, how so much of that was made possible or is predicated on the fact of videos and the fact of cell phones and video recordings, and that, we might not be having this conversation. I mean, there would still be these acts of violence, but this discussion may have happened, it may not have happened, So I was thinking about the video recordings, and then I thought about, what do these videos mean to family members? And how unsettling that is, because it's essentially televising the death of a child or a sibling or a parent, and there's no dignity in that death. But at the same time, without that video recording, there isn't this public conversation and public outcry. And it just there have been so many levels there, just multiple levels of trauma that families are experiencing. But I think also we as a society are kind of dealing with this collective grief in different ways and different degrees. It's not all the same, And so I was just thinking about those just deeply disturbing facts of our present. And then from that, I was, I mentioned three things that I thought we could reflect on is just, what are the systems and structures that produce this? And I thought about cultures of anti-Blackness, which I think intersect with what Megan is talking about. So cultures of anti-Blackness, devaluing of Black lives, and devaluing of Black grief. And also just a larger culture that erases Indigenous peoples and Indigenous presence, and that, Indigenous peoples or identities are essentially rendered invisible unless convenient for some dominant narrative, like Thanksgiving or sports teams. And that's just something that's, an aspect of our present, and it connects to our histories of colonialism and capitalism that produce modern nation states in the Americas. I mean, there's, throughout the Americas, it's this history of colonialism and erasure or, annihilation of Indigenous peoples and enslavement. And that's the foundation of our culture. And I was also thinking about, just histories of colonialism and capitalism and the production of just the idea of race. That this is such a salient social category in our contemporary world, I think points to the ongoing legacies of colonialism. It's not just past tense, it shapes our present. And then just the last thing that I was reflecting on is, we have these televised, televised acts of violence. But I was also just thinking about the acts of violence that are invisible. And so that includes, those things that aren't recorded. But I was also thinking about those structures or aspects of our society that might not even be seen as violent. And so I'm thinking about like disparities between people's experiences of law enforcement, just even with the recent Capitol insurrectionists being out on bail. And then I was thinking about the story of Police Browder, this child in New York City who was accused of stealing a backpack and spent almost 3 years in prison in Rikers, I believe.
Yep, and committed suicide.
And ends his own life. Whereas the Capitol insurrectionist, one was allowed to go to vacation in Mexico for a team building work trip. And the fact that these two things are happening, in the same society is violent. And so those are a lot of things, but those are some things that I was thinking.
I mean, between the things that the two of you have said, there's so much to unpack in terms of the inequities that exist within our society and how those inequities impact the way the world views Black and brown people, and also to the latter, how Black and brown people view themselves in return. And it goes back to that idea of Du Bois and double consciousness, right? Because I'm a Black male that goes to a predominantly white institution, right? My Blackness didn't become so apparent to me until I got around so many white people. And the way in which they looked at me started to be a reflection of myself and how I viewed them. And so it's really interesting that you bring this up. And then another thing that I wanted to talk about, you bring about, we have a social psychologist here, and you're bringing up trauma. And the trauma that comes from having to navigate, having to watch yourself be killed on camera over and over again, having to be constantly be the topic of conversation in and outside the classroom in these higher institutions of learning, whether it is in a apathetic or sympathetic way, and the kind of effects it has on you. And then to a much more narrow level, when you look at these communities of predominantly people of color and their relationship with power or authority, and how that's shaped by the way in which the world views them and the way in which they view themselves, right? And so I want to jump back to you, because one thing that I'm interested in understanding is, like in the beginning of your statement, you mentioned how there's a difference between somebody pulling out a gun and shooting someone in a split-second decision, and somebody else, and other types of deaths or violence, right? So I'm just trying to understand the psychological process of someone like Officer Chauvin, who kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while the man begged for his life.
Yeah,
Or
that is a very different process than
Right.
implicit bias.
or George Michael and his son following someone and taking their life away, right? And which is also a very different process. But also in New York City, where I'm from, the Fulani community, like in, I forgot what year, but Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times, not by one cop, but a group of cops, for simply reaching into his pocket. So I want to understand what kind of psychological effects this has on these communities of color, the kind of psychological impacts it has on the aggressors and the perpetrators. And is this, because you talk about implicit bias, which means it is something that you're doing without sometimes even being cognizant of it. And if you're not cognizant of it, does that mean that racism is endemic? And there is no solution to these issues? And from your perspective, from the global studies perspective, you could tell us, like, then how do we address this system? Are we just gonna keep talking about it for generations? Because we've been talking about this since the beginning of our history, right? So we're gonna start in here and then move on to Dr. to Sandhya.
Those were so many
So many
really
things to
deep
unpack.
topics. Yeah.
So many.
So I think we can start with, I'm going to start with Amadou Diallo because of the shooting of an unarmed black man who just reaches into his pocket.
Right.
And that particular instance you can connect to implicit bias because we have a lot of evidence that shows that with police particularly and with the general population, because of implicit bias, people are more likely to link crime with black images, with black faces, because that's what they've been programmed to do through contact with the media, right? They've been receiving all of these messages. And we've seen that police are more likely to mistake regular objects, like a cell phone, as a weapon if it's held by a black person than if it's held by a white person.
Okay.
So automatically we see that implicit bias shifting what people even think they see.
Right.
Right, and that's particularly dangerous.
Right.
And especially when police are thinking, there's a threat and I need to act now, and that ends lives.
Right.
Right? So in that respect, one thing that has to be done is to, and this is something that some of these implicit bias trainings do, is encourage police to slow down.
Right.
Right? But you had mentioned particularly the death of George Floyd, right? And someone kneeling on his neck for nearly 9 minutes.
Right.
That's not a result of implicit bias, right? Here we have an instance of someone who had a history with George Floyd, who had a history of complaints against him for use of force,
Right.
right? So here we have an individual particularly who may, and I can't say because I've never interacted with this person, but who likely has a particular focus on social dominance orientation, so feeling like they should be in control and that police particularly should have control of others. And that personality trait of really enforcing hierarchies and power hierarchies might have influenced that particular instance.
Right.
And some of the recommendations that have been made with police reform is to create some sort of national registry of complaints against police, because right now there's really no long-term record keeping where people who are in the police force who have had complaints about use of force against them, there's no way to say, okay, after this certain amount of time, you're out of the force, right? Because we see that you have this history of this. Right now, you could resign from the police force in one place and get a job in a different police force without any kind of connection to your history of having complaints of force used against you. So that's a particular problem. I think, now I'm forgetting what your initial.
No worries.
There were so many comments.
It was a lot to unpack, and
I had a thought, though.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I had a intersecting thought, and in the case of the person who murders George Floyd, and he's acting on this impulse to be dominant. But I'm thinking that also intersects with cultures of anti-Blackness, and who is he dominant? Who is he dominating? Who does he need to dominate? Whose life is expendable to him? And I think it's a place of intersection. And I was also just thinking about this disposition of dominance. Is that something that's intrinsic to policing?
or is it intrinsic to human behavior as a whole, right? I mean, I don't even know where I'm getting into, but the point is that idea of dominating Black and brown people is not necessarily secluded to policing itself.
No.
But
Right.
I don't know if I think it's human nature. I'm not a psychologist,
Right.
but
There's a lot of variability there, and that actually connects to your questions about vigilantism,
Right.
So people who engage in that sort of vigilante violence
Mm.
often really believe in social dominance and hierarchies and being themselves at the top of that hierarchy.
Right.
And that, I think, in the United States can be particular to white Americans, right? Because of this history of historical trauma and this kind of false narrative that white people are losing power, right? So with a lot of vigilantes today, and you can think back to the Capitol insurrectionists, there's this belief that they're losing power, that they're losing status, that any sort of hardship with respect to not having a job, with respect to not having money in the bank, right? Any kind of hardships, people are looking for a scapegoat for.
So these marginalized groups then become that scapegoat. And then you touched a little bit on the systems and cultures that produce the kind of things that we see in the society. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I just think, I mean, it's reflected in the culture that we all participate in. So Meg mentioned media, but I'm also thinking about like education. And I think also like having to couple anti-Blackness or indigenous erasure with normative whiteness, and that sometimes gets unstated, but that is, you know, whiteness is presented as the norm of humanity, or what it means to be a full citizen, a full human, a full person.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's just embedded in the culture. It's like the basis of the economy. It's the basis of the foundation of the nation.
Right.
And it kind of builds up from that.
I mean, we're not gonna break down all of the issues of this system in our society in this conversation, but in 2 minutes, could you tell us some practical things that we could do, or some things that you see that are like broad problems within our society that you could point to and be like, that is a root of anti-Blackness and it leads to something like this?
So identify what is I'm sorry, can you say it again?
So if you can identify a couple of things that within this broader system that you're referring to, that is like a root of anti-Blackness, whether it is historical, whether it is something in the present, for people to understand that we're not talking about things in the abstract. We're talking about very real things that happen on an everyday basis.
I mean, I talk about this a bit in my one class. But we talk about like the foundation of this nation and the economy is built upon the labor of enslaved peoples. And in that, in context of enslavement, yes, I feel like the roots of anti-Blackness building there. That's when we have this idea of race forming and the sort of dehumanization of Blackness because it was essential for the economy. And those ideas still endure. So we think about like, you know, stereotypes that are circulated and, you know, that are kind of, you know, placed upon Black people and Black bodies. You can see their origins in enslavement and in slave catchers. Just this notion that Black bodies can endure pain more than white bodies, or just valuing Black people for physical presence for physical prowess rather than intellectual prowess.
Right.
That's all rooted in an economy of enslavement.
Right. I mean, one thing you said about valuing the physical than the intellectual, like I can even speak to my own experience of like stereotypes on this campus, right? Like when I wear this suit and I'm sitting here with my professors, I'm well respected. But the moment I wear my jeans and my hoodie and walk down to the pub, people start looking at me weird, you know? And so I know there's a lot of people that don't believe in this idea of microaggressions or like how people see you and stuff like that. But maybe you can touch on the idea of microaggressions a little bit as well.
Yeah.
But I have witnessed it I have experienced it, right? Where like I'm walking on campus and wearing my bandana and my jeans, and someone that I know and that I'm very close to looks at me and goes, "Why are you dressed this way?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "This, why are you wearing this?" Like, implying something about it. And she did this in front of a crowd. And the crowd response was to laugh. You know? And so their perception of me made me feel like a guest in someone else's space. And I know this experience is not unique to me, right? And so could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and that actually directly connects to your questions about the psychological impact of all of this, too, of watching violence towards Black individuals. So with microaggressions, it's a major topic in psychology right now because it's been shown to have huge impacts on mental health and well-being for marginalized communities. So microaggressions are, generally speaking, just small slights or insults that at least seem innocuous at the time. You know, they're just a one-off comment that someone makes before going about their day, right? But they have a cumulative impact on someone's well-being. Because you can imagine, I mean, you know from personal experience that you are constantly being exposed to these little comments. And the metaphor that's frequently used with microaggressions is it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Each new insult, each new microaggression is another injury, another slight against you, and that builds up and creates a lot of negative impact in terms of rates of depression and anxiety amongst marginalized communities. So I think something that we also really underplay, and Sandhya, what you were talking about earlier makes me think about this, is the role of historical trauma in mental health and well-being as well. And this everyday exposure to real violence in modern days, right? Looking at violence and the video footage of people being killed just because of the color of their skin, that has a major impact on mental health and well-being too. There is one particular scholar, Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, a term that she coined, and just talking about how the historical trauma and that history of slavery has a real meaningful impact on people today. So I think we underestimate all the different sources of negative mental health that are impacting Black Americans particularly.
In other words, Black mental health matters.
Yes.
And so, Dr. G,
I had an idea though, that maybe I was sort of like picking up on what Megan was saying, but you know, returning it, thinking about structures.
How anti-Blackness gets so pervasive and it's internalized
by people who then don't see themselves as racist and who create policies, who run businesses, who structure the economy. And it's easy to point to these, I mean, that's what I mentioned in the beginning about like, well, what's invisible? I mean, it's easy to see what's on tape, and it's easy to see violence that results in death. But it's less easy to see, you know, even with microaggressions, and how these are ideas or just assumptions that people hold within them, and you know, they cause harm to their friends or to their classmates. But you know, the root of these ideas might be just kind of this culture of anti-Blackness, of an indigenous erasure, that leads one to create laws, to create policies.
Which is internalized. I mean, to speak to that point, like, I'm the president and the founder, or one of the founders of the Black Learning Initiative, which is a group on campus that is actively working to address anti-Blackness and at St. Lawrence University, and to look at the strengths and weaknesses of our administrative, co-curricular, our curriculum's efforts to be actively anti-racist, right? And so, through that, I advocated, or the entire group, we advocated for the foundation of a grant program which focuses on exposing or increases scholarly work around race, thus getting more white students, which is the predominantly, the majority group on campus, involved in having these conversations and exposed to these things, right? My first year, there was a young woman from Montana that told me, oh, you're like the first Black person that I met, right? But she wants to be a doctor. And if she's a doctor and ends up in a community, in an underserved community, and don't understand the realities of that community, that's problematic to me. And I feel like as a higher institution of learning, no student should be graduating any institution without being exposed to things like this, right? And you talk about public policy, which shapes every facet of our lives. And we are raising the future leaders of our institutions who come from predominantly white communities, never been exposed to anything Black or BIPOC, Black indigenous groups and organizations. And then in return, makes policies for those groups, right? And so can you touch a little bit on how that perpetuates this system of endemic problems that we constantly talk about in our society?
I mean, I was thinking about one example, which is the encounter you were talking about and wanting to go, and this friend or student wants to study medicine. And then I'm looking at like Black and infant mortality rates and the extreme disparities in Black and infant mortality rates. And it's a consequence of doctors not believing Black pain or not believing Black pregnant people when they're telling them that they're dealing with issues or they're having symptoms. And so, yeah, it's kind of deeply embedded in education even. So, policies and all of that, but just even the educational curriculum from the ground up.
Right. So we're nearing towards the end. So I have two questions for each one. A question for each one of you that I would like to see. So basically, you talk about implicit bias being something that is sometimes even unconscious, that we do without knowing that we're doing. If we don't know we're doing it, how do we deal with it? Because it is a luxury to be in an environment where people are constantly talking about it. It is a luxury to have the opportunity to take these trainings. Not many Americans or not many people around the globe have that luxury. And then how do we measure the effectiveness of these trainings that we take surrounding race? Right. If we don't have like a marker, like are you less racist because you went to a training? Are you less likely to commit a problem like for minorities because you went to two trainings? But and then for for Sandhya, does a focus on systems of oppression, systemic racism, implicit bias, or rather a focus on less personal aspects of these issues and interactions in society tend to dehumanize or depersonalize the people that are involved, both the aggressors and the victims. So if we can talk about that for a little bit and then wrap up, that would be amazing.
I mean, I can just say quickly about, this systemic focus. I think that, we have to think about systems. We have to look at structures and like identify the ways they are rooted in white supremacy or rooted in these kind of economic systems, economies of capitalism and colonialism that dispossess people of land, dispossess people of their livelihood. So we have to do that and note it. But I think it's also important to do a kind of like multi-scalar analysis and to like start with ourselves and think about how we are also participating in this system. We're not outside looking in. We're participating in it, and we can work to interrupt it. We can work to challenge it. We can work to center other voices, Black voices, Indigenous voices, to challenge the dominant white narrative. But yeah, so I do think system and structural thinking is important, but it has to be done in a multi-scalar way, thinking about how does this impact real people living in real places in real times, and how does it impact us?
Yeah, so this question comes up a lot about how do we get rid of implicit bias, and really the consensus is you might not be able to. We teach a lot about implicit bias because it's really important to acknowledge that it exists. While we probably can't completely eliminate this unconscious bias that people have, we can train them to behave differently as a result. So you might be able to change some stereotypes that people hold. You might be able to provide them with counter stereotypes to get rid of the original ones. But what we can do is have people engage in different policies that are designed to circumvent some biases that we have. But we can also encourage people to slow down and ask themselves, would I be acting this way, or would I say this if not for this person being Black, if not for this person being an Indigenous person, right? So there are certain techniques that we can do to highlight the impact of implicit bias on behavior, and the behavior we can change more readily. But in terms of how do we know if implicit bias trainings work, there's a lot of different ways that scientists have attempted to address this, and one of them is through implicit association tests, which is just measuring how quickly you make associations between different groups of people and objects, or different groups of people and words, and that the quickness, the speed with which you make associations tells us how strong that attitude is in your mind. Or how many mistakes you make tells us how strong that attitude is in your mind. But there are a lot of different behavioral outcomes that we could measure too, like how often do you avoid people from different social groups, right? Or how many, in the case of police officers, how often have you used excessive force since this training, or just had a complaint because of use of force, right? There's a lot of different behavioral outcome variables that we can also look at in addition to the cognitive variables of implicit association tests.
That's great. We have to wrap up in a bit, but any last minute comments, takeaways, or offers you have for the public, or things that you think we as an audience should be thinking about?
I think still, continuing to have these conversations, taking a hard look in the mirror, and our individual mirror as well as our societal mirror, reckon with history and how it continues to shape the present.
I think just the fact that everyone has implicit biases is not a free pass to be racist or to ignore racist behavior that you engage in. You still have this moral imperative, this obligation to society, really, to do better.
Well, that was our show for today. I just want to thank you guys so much for coming out and speaking with us. We truly appreciate it. I would get up and shake all of your hands, but coronavirus. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming, and we truly appreciate you. We're going to continue these conversations at home, and we're not going to stop here because racism is not going anywhere. These oppressive institutions are not going anywhere as well. So we cannot give up. We don't have the luxury to be tired and stop. Thank you. Hey, if you stayed till the end of that video, I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our channel and leave a thumbs up. Also, follow our Instagram page, the link in the description below. Just do it. It only takes 1 second. Just do it. Just do it.